So we look already at health inequalities, if you remember, the transformation of work and families, the possibility of implementing basic income schemes, and last week, Brexit. So given the theme of this seminar, we could not include something on migration, and we were very delighted when Kimberly accepted our invitation to speak on this topic. And I'm sure that all of you probably are already familiar with Kimberly works, but I wanted to say a few words of introduction. So Kimberly Morgan is professor of political science at George Washington University in DC. And she has written many articles and books about the politics of public policy, both in Western Europe and the United States. And her research has spanned many areas, and theoretical and empirical contribution from the politics of work family policies to the governance of healthcare, and more recently, migration. Just to mention some of her books, I can't probably mention all her works, but some of her books are Working Mothers and the Welfare State, Religion and the Politics of Work Family Policy in Western Europe and the United States, The Delegated Welfare State, Medicare, Markets and the Governance of American Social Policies, and I co-edited several co-edited volumes, including The Many Hands on the State, Theorizing Political Authority and Social Control. So I will leave the floor to Kimberly, who's going to speak today about hostile environments, immigration enforcement, and state infrastructural power in Western Europe. Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, Rosella and Marek. It's a great opportunity for me to present this work in progress. There's a paper behind this, so if anybody is interested, I'm happy to share the paper as well. So when we think of the term immigration enforcement, usually what comes to mind are things like border walls, men with guns or women with guns, whoever with guns, dogs, barbed wire, searchlights, the whole thing. We might also think about raids and roundups and detention and ultimately deportation. So these are the kinds of concepts that come to mind and realities that come to mind when you hear immigration enforcement. But the reality of undocumented migration is that most people don't arrive by trying to cross borders forcefully, sneakily in the middle of the night. People arrive legally and tend to overstay. Usually people come in with visas and stay beyond the time allowed and end up undocumented in that way. Or they could have a situation where they come seeking asylum and the case is rejected and they end up staying. So this is the more common route by which people become undocumented. So, there's also, when we think about sort of processes of enforcing immigration law, the sort of other area we might think about are forced removal mechanisms like, detention and deportation. But in liberal democracies, the reality there is that there are considerable barriers to actually enforcing these kinds of measures. There are lots of legal protections that people have, especially when seeking asylum. There's humanitarian values expressed often by many in civil society and people in politics who resist pursuing a really strict policy of detention and deportation. And there literally can be civil society resistance against these measures as well. And so actually, using deportation as the dominant strategy for responding to undocumented migration faces a lot of obstacles. There also are logistical barriers to doing this, that it's, finding people is not easy and deporting people is not easy. Not to say that it doesn't happen all the time, but that there's a lot of, in a sense, expense involved in trying to locate people and then keep them in detention and then go through all the legal processes and then actually deport them. And so in a sense, for a cost benefit analysis perspective from that of state officials, it's costly with relatively little return. And so, given these realities, what's happened instead is that you end up with, undocumented migration, undocumented populations that establish themselves in advanced industrialized countries. And then the issue for governments is how to respond. Well, you can see from this data that the U.S. has a much higher number of people, unauthorized migrants living in the United States compared to Europe. So these are numbers in the millions, they're estimates, but you can see that the numbers, truth be told, they're not all that high as a percent of population in either place, but much higher in the United States than in Europe. So despite all these challenges facing governments in Europe with regard to enforcing immigration law, the reality is that the numbers are actually fairly low in the European context, albeit spread unevenly across Europe. So the question then I think becomes, how is it that immigration law is actually enforced? What is actually doing the work here of preventing migrants from remaining on the terrain of European countries once they arrive there? And I think the more dominant strategy in many ways has been one of enforcing, using all kinds of internal mechanisms, setting up lots of barriers to people being able to live and flourish on, in countries without legal status. So barring people's access to public services is an essential part of this. Making sure that they don't have access to work is really in many ways the linchpin. So putting barriers around labor market access, putting barriers more generally around the private economy and society as a whole is a much, in a sense, kind of more meaningful and I would argue more effective way to prevent people from staying. In a sense, the strategy here is to try to induce people to decide either not to come or to leave of their own accord, to decide not to stay in a country because it's become too impossible to live there, because they're not able to work and not able to find housing and have difficulties even getting a cell phone or having a bank account. So you make it hard for people to stay and they choose to leave. Back in 2012, when Mitt Romney ran for president in the United States, he proclaimed this should be the strategy in the United States, that we needed to adopt these kind of policies, and that he described this as a policy of self-deportation, where people would deport themselves of their own accord, thereby freeing up the state from having to do the work itself, which, as I said before, is costly and difficult. So a strategy of self-deportation, it was a campaign line that he was much criticized for. People thought it was a really right-wing approach back then, and then Donald Trump came along and now people look back and say, well, Romney, he wasn't so bad. But at the time it was very controversial in the United States that he proposed this whole idea. It should be familiar as well to British audiences, a similar strategy under the rubric of the hostile environment policies of the conservatives starting in roughly 2010. Going up until recent years when it was renamed the compliant environment policy, but it was known as the hostile environment policy for a long time, and many still refer to it as such. This was the policy hatched under Theresa May when she was Home Secretary, hatched along with David Cameron as Prime Minister at the time, that it was a strategy of barring access to public benefits and services of all kinds, making sure that unauthorized migrants would not be able to access them, of drawing those boundaries around the labor market, of enforcing employer sanctions and doing various kinds of measures to make sure that people couldn't access work, denying people access to rental housing by having landlords check people's papers, denying access to bank accounts by having banks check whether people have a legal right to have a bank account, whether they have legal status, and preventing people from having access to driver's licenses. So these are some of the major aspects of the policy. Other governments have, well, this got a lot of attention internationally and in the UK for the kind of bombastic rhetoric that accompanied this and the tough statements that were made by May and others to create a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. In a sense, it reflects a common template of policies elsewhere that have been less trumpeted from the roofs, but don't look so much different. The general template across Europe has been to so-called demagnetize the labor market through employer sanctions and strict enforcement efforts, to try to impose sanctions on employers if they hire unauthorized migrants. It's also a whole set of initiatives targeting the informal economy. These are initiatives at the EU level as well as at the level of national governments. Sorry, I got this in there. Limiting access to the welfare state, making sure that although in general unauthorized migrants everywhere have access for their children to education through the age of 16 or 18, so public education is a right, basic health care is guaranteed. But beyond that, there's considerable limits on the extent to which people can access various kinds of benefits. Some variation across countries in this, but as a whole, access to the welfare state has been cut off in the last few decades. And then further barring access to the private economy, whether it's renting, banking, driving, transportation, like I said before, cell phone access, it can be library card access, it can be any number of things that one might wish to have that one cannot have if you lack proof of one's legal residency. So, the question then for me became, as I looked at these initiatives, was to think about why different countries, while adopting this template, in fact, implemented them in rather different ways. And I think one could say that the implementation in the UK of the hostile environment initiatives was in many ways quite disastrous from the standpoint of many people, but including from the standpoint of state officials. Among the things that happened were major errors, excluding people from access to benefits and services. So lots of mistakes that were made, I'll talk more about in a moment. There was considerable resistance against implementation. So the kinds of, the various public officials who were tasked with implementing the laws resisted doing so. That was especially prominent in the NHS. Civil society mobilized against this in a variety of ways. And there were some really high profile scandals, as well as some court rulings that basically led to a freezing or full blocking of some of the measures as they tried to implement them. Looking at two other countries that engaged in similar templates, but somewhat earlier, we could look at the Netherlands, which adopt a very similar set of policies in the early 1990s. And there was some initial resistance by both bureaucratic actors and by groups in civil society, but a lot of that resistance was largely overcome. And so I would say overall implementation now is high, and that the policy initiatives have been effectively implemented throughout the society. France is a contrasting case, which actually adopted a similar set of policies as the Netherlands did, or tried to in the 1990s. But implementation, I would argue, is very mixed. For one thing, it's been very slow. I would say that the French have been trying to find a way to implement these measures for decades and are continuing to encounter various forms of resistance, whether it's from civil society, in particular trade unions have been strong opponents of enforcing restrictions at the level of labor markets. But then there's been bureaucratic resistance or just kind of incapabilities in a variety of ways and actually implementing the various kinds of measures. So this was what I became interested in trying to understand. I wanted to understand what accounts for differences in the ability of governments to implement these exclusionary policies, these policies to exclude people from their societies and their economies. And then I wanted to think more broadly about implications of that for thinking about the workings of the state and how we should theorize state power in these advanced industrialized societies, and broader implications then for thinking about politics in Europe and for societies as well as for migrants themselves. So this is the basis of the project and what I have spent the last couple of years studying, and has culminated in this paper and this talk. So first, a little bit of theory on how I approach this question. There's a big set of debates, a longstanding set of debates in the migration literature about the power of states to deal with the problem of what Christian Jopka calls unwanted migration, basically unauthorized migrants or other undesired migrants from the standpoint of different societies. This is his terminology. And in the popular debates and certainly in political rhetoric, I think often the perspective is no, that states have lost control, that they can't handle this situation of unwanted migration. So it's really a kind of story of state incapacity. The scholarship on this has been more mixed, and I will spare you the details, the ins and outs of these discussions. But on one side are people who say, no, states have great difficulties in controlling unauthorized migrants. They sort of self-limit their own sovereignty on these questions, whether for kind of legal reasons, humanitarian reasons, the fact that they're democracies. Globalization said to have kind of impeded the ability of states to control what happens in their borders or within their borders or crossing borders. Europeanization can be seen as weakening. And there's a kind of a view of a sort of hollowing out of state capacity as a consequence of Europeanization. Functions get transferred up to Europe and down to state governments, and the center kind of loses power. On the other side are people who tend to say, actually states have tons of power. If anything, they see a kind of panopticon, a kind of Foucaultian vision of a state that is all-seeing, that has rendered the societies legible and controllable, to kind of refer to Jim Scott's concept. So other people really think that states, and that especially when you're talking about unauthorized migration, what you see is this kind of immense power of states. So in a sense, what people are putting forward are quite different visions or theorizations of the state. And that's part of what I wanted to try to get at through this particular study. And in approaching this question, I came at it from this project that was an edited volume that I did with Anne Orloff a couple of years ago, where it has nothing to do with migration. There's not a single chapter on migration in the book, which in retrospect I found really weird. But it was basically the project was we wanted to kind of take stock of the literature on the state and where it stands in sociology and history and political science today. And among the things that we concluded as we did the survey of what people are writing about and brought various authors together is that we wanted to get away from a tendency to talk about the state in this very abstract and homogenizing way. That we all tend to use the term, and I've just used the term myself already several times, in a way that kind of obfuscates more than enlightens. It's such an abstract concept for something that is in fact so huge and vast and complex. And so we wanted in this project, Anne and I, to kind of move scholars away from this kind of homogenizing view, and in particular, the tendency to kind of view states as operating according to sort of one logic. And in the migration field, you'll hear the liberal state, the migration state, the deportation state. It kind of makes it seem as if the entire state is organized around a particular logic, which is not at all the case, because often various parts of the state work at cross purposes, have no idea what the other hand is doing, which is why we picked up on this terminology from Pierre Bourdieu about the many hands of the state, to think about the kind of multiplicity of actors and the incoherence by which action unfolds. And so to try to get a handle on that, what do we do then if we want to understand the state? One of the conclusions that we pushed forward in the book and that I'm pursuing in this project is to sort of counsel that we all move down the ladder of abstraction a couple of rungs and really focus in a very concrete, maybe even granular way at how states entities actually do things and why they do them the way they do, but even more how they do them, how power is actually exercised. And doing that often it requires, really burrowing deep in to kind of see how systems operate within the state and how actors connect or don't connect with each other. And our view is that this would help us better understand how state power actually operates. So on immigration, policy and enforcement, I think is a really great site actually for thinking about these kinds of questions, because once I started to kind of look into the realities of immigration enforcement, and I saw that you can't assume that just because a policy is on the books that it's actually effectively enforced, that we have many examples of immigration policy not being particularly well enforced. And this is especially true of the kinds of exclusionary measures that I'm focusing on in this talk today, because they require to get, to actually implement these policies, you need buy-in from people who have not self-selected into the immigration enforcement line of work. Street level bureaucrats who work for welfare agencies, or people in the education sector, or people in civil society, whether it's employers or unions or NGOs who are providing assistance to migrants. You're basically asking people who don't want to do immigration enforcement, by and large, to assist in this set of policy initiatives. Among the kinds of responses that one can chart, and when you look at how people actually respond when asked to do these things, there are always some amount of people who want to actively participate and are fine with implementing these policies. There's others who just kind of go along. Maybe they're not fully paying attention, or maybe they just sort of, it becomes just part of their job. Checking people's identities, checking people's papers is just part of what you do. There's open resistance, where people fight back, they mount campaigns, they quit, they turn to the media, they resist. And then I think what's also quite common is a kind of foot dragging, or what Jim Scott refers to as hidden forms of resistance, where people basically don't follow what they're supposed to do, but they don't make a big stink about it. They just kind of drag their feet and maybe gum up implementation in that way. So, these are the kind of realities for thinking about how enforcement unfolds when you're looking at these kinds of exclusionary measures. But I think this could probably apply to many other ways. So in trying to then conceptualize differences in implementation and thinking about how I would characterize these differences, what I found helpful was the term coined, the concept developed by the sociologist Michael Mann many decades ago, of infrastructural power, as a way to kind of think about how implementation actually unfolds, and gives a sort of way of thinking about whether implementation is effective or not very effective. And, this is a term that he used in contrast with despotic power, which is the kind of raw imposition of force. Infrastructural power is the ability to kind of work through civil society, to coordinate with different actors in society, to induce agreement, to get people to work towards common goals, to kind of move societies, economies, states forward, without having to use raw force. So this is the kind of concept as he developed it. But beyond this distinction with despotic power, I think there's questions about gradations. I mean, infrastructural power is not a kind of either or quality, but a variable quality. So then the question is, how could we kind of actually study this? That's actually tricky. But what I found helpful were interventions by a couple of scholars thinking about this. One set of scholars, Hillel Seufer and Matthias von Hau, argue that we should think about infrastructural power as having really kind of two faces. And they're studying this in the context of education policy in Latin America, so very different context. But it's basically an argument that, infrastructural power operates first between bureaucrats and the policymakers. The policymakers make the policy, and then you have to get the civil servants to implement. So that's one site or one sort of dimension of infrastructural power. And the other dimension is through civil society, the sort of capacity to get groups in civil society on board. So Sid Tarrow then added that to this, an insight coming from his perspective on social movements, that when you're talking about infrastructural power and thinking about these dynamics, it's a two-way street in a sense. It's not a kind of command and control, but you open up room for negotiation or for mutual influence, that you open up space for those on the other end to resist, to foot drag, to push back, to demand changes, and so on. And so when we think about implementation, you have to think about this, these dynamics, working through bureaucrats, working through civil society, and then the kind of pushback or negotiation that comes in return. So all of this seemed to fit well for me in thinking about this particular area, the implementation of these exclusionary policies and why they look different in different contexts. But still, I was left with a question of how to actually, pin down, operationalize and measure some of the things that I was wanting to study. So among the things that's challenging with something like immigration enforcement is to figure out how to show people that enforcement has been more effective in one context than in another context. And there's lots of reasons why this is difficult. Some people have suggested that I should just, use, numbers of undocumented people to the extent we can count them in different societies as evidence of effectiveness. So I did take a look at some of the numbers. These are in thousands. So the high for France is 300 to 400,000 people who are undocumented migrants, less than 100,000 in the Netherlands, the UK estimates range from 800,000 to 1.3 million. So this is some data that came out of a U.S. research center, and there's been some criticism about its utility for reasons that I won't go into. But there's some other data that other types of studies that I think are a little bit more reliable that can kind of give an indication about outcomes in terms of the numbers of people who are unauthorized who are living in these 3 countries. And it does seem like from the available Dutch studies that there was a really significant decline in the number of unauthorized migrants from somewhere around 200,000 in the 1990s to very low estimates now, 35,000, 50,000, something like that. So kind of congruent with the idea that in the 1990s, all these measures came into place. These are not the only measures, other measures came into place as well. But this does kind of correspond with the overall story. In France, there's actually been, from the best evidence, an increase in the number of unauthorized migrants. And that's actually reasonably well tracked because France has a special medical system just for unauthorized migrants. And so you can actually see the number of people who are signed up for it. And there has been an increase. The UK, by all accounts, has had a quite significant increase in the number of unauthorized since the 2000s. So, much higher than France, and a significant increase throughout this period. So that's kind of consistent with the overall story and says something about the degree of implementation, although I think it's a very imperfect way of thinking about it. Among the problems are the various, methodological difficulties of counting people who don't want to be counted and who are hard to find. The fact that people migrate to and from countries for lots of reasons. And so just because these policies are put in place doesn't necessarily tell you what impact they have. Other types of barriers, with studying this, enforcement data itself is really problematic. It's really hard to compare across countries, these types of policies, including policies like employer sanctions. The EU, which has an employer sanctions directive that imposes on countries, has been trying to amass data that's comparable for some time and has had very little success on this. And just more generally, if you look at, sort of enforcement metrics, like the number of sanctions that are imposed on employers for hiring unauthorized migrants, you run into a kind of pervasive denominator problem where you don't really know sort of what the size of the population of violators is vis-a-vis the numbers who have been assessed, the numbers of fines that have been assessed. So difficulties kind of sorting out what to make of this type of data. So given that, the way I study this is largely qualitative. I basically, track the activities of various state entities using a variety of primary and secondary sources. I also conducted some interviews to kind of help me try to make sense, interviews with, NGO officials, with some government officials, just to try to understand the workings of, the state enforcement apparatus. Journalistic accounts, government documents. I spent a lot of time reading hearings. The hearings are interesting because they usually involve state officials themselves trying to figure out what the heck is going on, how the state works. They don't really know either. They're trying to figure out why stuff works or doesn't work. So it was kind of, those were often helpful for me as I'm puzzling, trying to figure out how these different systems operate. And what I basically looked for were those two faces of infrastructural power. I looked to see whether it seemed like the different hands of the state are actually working in concordance with each other. Is power projected across state agencies in a way that the goals of the policymakers are actually met because the different agencies actually work together to sort of meet the goals that they have set out? And what happens when you start approaching non-state actors for involvement? Do they actually, sorry, I didn't mean to go ahead so quickly. Do they actually comply? Do the civil society groups, do employers? What do we know about sort of the behavior of labor unions vis-a-vis the kinds of mandates that are put forward? So this was what I tried to kind of, do to figure out whether or not, how implementation actually worked. So then what's my explanation then? I mean, that the ultimate goal here was to explain these differences in implementation across these three countries. And what I found was that basically two factors could help explain the differences in these three cases. One set of arguments concerns pre-existing systems of population oversight. By pre-existing, I mean, having nothing to do with immigration originally. So historically created population registries that are mandatory or local or central registers that basically contain information about people and where they reside and are continually updated to keep track of what they're up to. These registries basically facilitate digitalized exclusion of people. They were updated in the Netherlands, for instance, basically to serve the goal of immigration enforcement. And among the reasons I think why this is such a potent resource is because it enables a kind of circumventing of possible resistance on the part of the various bureaucrats and even civil society groups, because it makes checking people's status very seamless and automatic. It's just something that you do. You just check that, you type the person's name into a computer and it tells you whether or not they have eligibility. And you do that anyway for people. So it makes this just part of the sort of regular job of a civil servant. People basically, if they don't have status in a country and they're trying to access something, what maybe it's housing, they basically bump off up against what the Dutch scholar Denizens has called digital walls, which I find a very kind of evocative way to sort of explain what people are up against. The second factor is labor relations, is the extent of cooperation that exists between the state and organized labor. And that's because exclusion from work is really central to the whole enterprise. I mean, in many ways, it's the most important exclusion that can happen. And it's I think the biggest deterrent against trying to live in a country is if one cannot find work. And so, what I found in investigating this is that countries that had the tradition and enduring corporatist institutions were places in which labor unions behaved differently towards unauthorized migrants. And this was based on a larger study that I did of more European countries, where I tested this idea. And I basically found that labor unions' willingness to kind of, put a watchful eye on labor markets, on work sites and so on, hinges very much on whether or not they have been part of these corporatist structures, whether they see themselves as part of the state in essence and have a kind of stake in continuing to get along with public officials. Lacking that tradition, unions have moved in a different direction, have become much more kind of oppositional towards the state on questions of unauthorized migration, much more engaged in unionization drives, in resistance, in mobilizing strikes of unauthorized workers and trying to kind of resist these measures and really fighting things like employer sanctions. There's a kind of additional way in which this matters, in that implementation of something like these labor market structures or measures require that the labor inspectorate, the people who actually check working conditions, have some sort of buy-in with the policies. And the labor inspectorates are often linked in a variety of ways to labor unions. And their willingness to participate in this is much more likely in a corporatist system than in a system where a more pluralist set of structures. And that's something that's really borne out in the case studies. So, corporatism, at least I have some numbers for that if we want to think about sort of differences across countries in this. This is from some other work that I've done on this topic. But if we look at the Netherlands, it's actually a case that has a long corporatist tradition. If anything, it's been shored up in recent years. Labor unions have worked hard to try to maintain these institutions and maintain their place in them. And enforcement at work sites has been a portion of that. In the UK and France, my other cases, very much not true at all. And labor unions have adopted a much more oppositional stance towards the state on many things, including on the question of unauthorized migrant workers. All right, so is there a risk that what I'm saying here is kind of circular, that infrastructural power begets infrastructural power? Yes, I am actually, because I think what in essence I saw in doing this research was how these pre-existing forms of infrastructural power, and I think of corporatism as an amazing example of infrastructural power now that I sort of understand it in that light, These are pre-existing qualities that had nothing to do with migration, but in essence, the power could be redeployed from one area that had nothing to do with migration to an area that has lots to do with migration. So population oversight systems, they have very deep historical roots, and they are a source of power for states. But then the question, they were not applied in a way that had much to do with migration until starting in the 1990s in many European countries. Similar, I'd say the same for corporatist labor relations. Corporatism had nothing to do with migration control, but the structures could be, in a sense, kind of redeployed in that way. And I think have been redeployed in that way in a number of places. Okay, so I'll just run through the case studies fairly quickly. But so, what I did was basically go back and look and try to understand how it was things like population registries came into place and why they were significant for the implementation of these exclusionary policies. So the Netherlands is notable for having, as actually one of the few countries in Europe that had mandatory municipal registries by the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, that basically record, births, deaths, crucial life events, and really importantly, know where people live and keep track of where they move. And so when you move, you have to tell the state that you've moved, and that gets recorded. And so they keep track of where everybody is. In 1936, there was actually a reform that created that sort of increased the capacity for tracking people. That was done by a civil servant who was very much a collaborator later with the Nazi regime. When the Nazis took power in control of the Netherlands, basically this civil servant was very much involved in facilitating their population oversight. And in fact, the system as set up in the Netherlands was quite admired by the Nazis, who thought it was a lot better than anything they had in Germany, and that they wanted to try to kind of replicate there. In fact, one of the things I learned in reading these histories was that resistance forces in the Netherlands against the occupation, one of the things they tried to do was attack municipal buildings so they could burn the registries and destroy their records, because they realized how effective these records were at keeping track of people, including keeping track of the Jewish population. So post-war, there was a real backlash against this as a consequence, as part of the sort of rejection of the interwar of the occupation and the collaboration. And so it meant an end to the formal identification cards that had been created, and a decentralization of the registries back to the local governments, still requiring people to notify officials when they move and major life events. But in other ways, it was kept fairly decentralized. Alongside this, there was also the development of a registry of information on foreigners starting in the 1980s, basically keeping track of people when they stay for more than 3 months in the Netherlands. So then a bunch of key reforms happen in the 1990s, reforms that try to seal off the public sector and the private economy from unauthorized migrants. And key to this, in implementing this, was to connect the various databases that were out there, including the registries of foreigners and these various municipal records and work records and tax and welfare records, to connect them all. And this was all made possible by the fact that everybody in the country had basically 2 numbers associated with them. And so those 2 numbers gave a wealth of information about people. And you could use that then to link the various databases and then keep track of people, and then therefore determine whether or not people had eligibility for a variety of things. Another important decision in this period was to basically bar undocumented residents from having one of those numbers, a social security number. Previously, this had been something that had been given out. The country had been fairly tolerant of unauthorized migrants and accepting of the fact that they're there, so enable them to work, give them access to social benefits. All of that was something that was very much part of life there until the mid-1990s. So barring people from having access to the social security number was important to this. And then in the 2000s, coordination is further facilitated by the creation of one number that basically covers everything. It's the number you need for anything in the Netherlands, certainly for access to public administration. You need your BSN or your citizen service number. But it also ends up being important in private life. It's something that opens, you need it for access to all kinds of private benefits as well. And in a sense, I think it's important because it helps overcome opposition to those digital walls that I mentioned earlier. In a sense, or not sort of opposition, it enables the sort of opposition that welfare officials might have you know, they might resist doing this kind of checking, but if it's just a matter of people punching in their number, then they bump into the digital walls. With regard to unauthorized work, again, I think those interlinked databases actually really facilitate enforcement. I mean, the most common practice for people seeking employment who lack status is to work on somebody else's card. You use somebody else's social security number, you use somebody else's number on their work permit. But that's a lot harder to do when there's a database keeping track of how many hits there are on that card. That sends an alert right away, and then officials know that there are people at this work site who are using cards and, you know, in multiple places. And so it makes it a lot tougher to actually use the most common practice that is out there for unauthorized migrants. In addition, unions, in my observation, sometimes have facilitated enforcement at various work sites. Now, Dutch unions have been a bit ambivalent about this. In some other corporatist countries like Germany and Sweden, I think they've been more active in participating in raids and in, you know, in policing work sites. But what's notable about unions in this context is they have not championed the cause of unauthorized migrants. They have not opposed crackdowns very vigorously, and in some cases have facilitated them. Alongside this, the Labor Inspectorate pursues and works fairly cooperatively with police or with immigration authorities in keeping an eye on work sites, again, to try to prevent people from gaining a foothold in paid work. I'll contrast this with the French case, where there has been a lot of resistance to a population registry of any kind. There's been resistance to the idea of linking databases up, of using a social security number as a basis for linking records is something that has been very much seen as taboo. This is going back many decades, one could even say centuries of resistance to the idea of the state having this kind of information about people. But most recently at a 2019 hearing, you know, one official who was pushing back at the idea of using the social security number said, no, but if we do that, then you can see everything about a citizen. You can know all these things about them, and that is absolutely objectionable in the French context. So instead, in France, of the development of a national or local population registration system, you have a proliferation of databases with lots of information about people in lots of different places. And this meant that when France tried to implement a very similar set of exclusionary laws to those developed in the 1990s by the Netherlands, it proved very slow and laborious to try to actually, you know, implement these things. And in a sense, they're still trying to implement them with, you know, some attempts to, let me get this head here, you know, among things, technical difficulties involved in trying to connect the different databases, because there's not that one number that you can use to kind of link people up. And also, it seems like some amount of bureaucratic foot dragging, where mandates were put down on social welfare ministries to, you know, to implement these measures, to check people's status, and they just weren't interested in doing this. They didn't want to have these abilities, so they didn't seek the capacities. They didn't try to actually build them up because it wasn't a priority for them to actually implement these kinds of policies. French labor relations also very different from the Dutch context, very antagonistic, a lot of resistance by labor unions. Increasingly, they get involved in conflicts over the treatment of unauthorized migrants and unauthorized migrant workers. Unions have become stronger and stronger defenders of unauthorized migrant workers, including through a bunch of strikes that they have organized in recent years. They started doing this in 2007. They organized workers to strike and demand that an employer sponsor their regularization. So this has been a kind of repertoire of the labor movement that's picked up in recent years. There's been some more strikes in the last couple of years. And sometimes they're actually successful. They succeed in getting, you know, unauthorized workers sponsored for legal papers. So it's actually something that has worked. And the other thing that was really striking in looking at the French case in contrast to the Dutch case is how much the Labor Inspectorate were reluctant to cooperate with immigration authorities, that they outright won't cooperate with them in many cases, not reporting people when they encounter them in the course of checking work sites for other types of labor violations. The Labor Inspectorate says, you know, this is not our responsibility. We're here to protect all workers, and we're not interested in facilitating immigration enforcement. So, you know, it's been the kind of stance overall. And I think, as I write in more detail in the paper, it's a reflection of their really close historical linkages with the labor movement, and also the fact that a lot of labor inspectors are unionized themselves and involved in union politics. And so they have adopted, in a sense, the kind of views or shaped the views of the labor movement in this regard. The UK case is also much like the French one in the sense of having no population registry and a lot of resistance to ever developing one. There's been proposals going all the way back to the mid-18th century of creating a population registry that's always been rejected. Instead, there's been a kind of multiplication of databases over time. Something that has often been bemoaned by those who would prefer some kind of, greater system for population oversight. As you can see, commentary at the various hearings about how chaotic the structures are for actually knowing where people are, knowing people's entitlement to various kinds of benefits and services. It's basically been kind of a mess. There's been a lot of resistance to developing something like national identity cards. The most recent effort had been under the Blair administration back in the 2000s, ultimately resisted. They passed the law for national identity cards, and then in 2010 it was revoked by the conservative liberal coalition government. Resistance against employer sanctions. The UK only adopted sanctions on employers for hiring unauthorized migrants in the mid 1990s, so later than other countries, and then didn't really implement them for a long time. So a lot of pushback against that, and pushback against sort of internal checks as a whole, as seen as really kind of contrary to the British way. As somebody said, it was actually a civil libertarian testifying at a 2019 hearing about the Windrush scandal. He said the broad system of public administration in the UK is based on the idea you don't have to prove your identity at various points. So pushback in that regard. There actually were no checks on legal status in giving out social security numbers until 2005. So again, kind of leaving a certain amount of openness for people to be able to live in the country, get access to some of the benefits, National Health Service, and so on. All of this really changes with the hostile environment policies. Now, there are precursors to what gets adopted under the Blair and Brown administrations. They called it a difficult environment. The conservative government then basically took it up and changed it to a hostile environment, but it's pretty similar, just much more developed set of initiatives, increasing the penalties on employers, requiring landlords to check people's legal status, having banks check all their bank accounts, having to make sure that people have status, restricting access to driver's licenses, and then attempting to set up all kinds of data sharing systems between various bureaucracies, the NHS, Department of Education, also reaching civil society groups like homeless charities, trying to share information about people's status, connecting with immigration bureaucracy information, and so on. As I think UK audiences know, one of the consequences of this was the debacle around people from the Windrush generation who found themselves excluded from access to society. These are people who arrived legally from Commonwealth countries until the early 1970s, when there was a shift in the law. And many people who settled and stayed, some of them never made formal moves to establish their legal status, but they didn't need to. I mean, they came legally and rightfully thought themselves, legally present in the UK. And some people over the course of decades lost, misplaced, didn't have paperwork to sort of show that they had legal status. But of course, they worked and lived and paid taxes in the UK for many decades. What happened when the digital walls went up was that people suddenly started bouncing up against them. They were ejected from work. They no longer had access to healthcare. They lost housing. They lost access to benefits. And in some cases, there were even some wrongful deportations. So people got caught up in the immigration enforcement system that was a reflection of those walls coming up that suddenly excluded them. And they weren't able to, many of them, to prove that they actually had been legally present in the UK. In many cases, they had been brought over as children and didn't necessarily know that they needed to have this kind of paperwork. So this was the most high profile debacle when it came to implementing these policies. But there was a lot of other resistance that really kind of pushed back and impeded implementation. Public officials refused to do what was asked of them. NHS doctors protested. In civil society, landlords and their, their associations pushed back and said, this is ridiculous. We don't want to be checking people's papers. We don't know whether this, this visa shows that they have a right to be here. This is not our role. Nonprofit organizations also pushed back. There were lawsuits in particular brought by landlords to try to prevent having to check people's legal status before renting to them. There's the overall backlash really accelerated by Windrush. And so, that put an end to some of the data sharing going on, froze the checks on bank accounts, put blockages in place for the implementation of a lot of the policies. There also has been a lot of union opposition to the whole policy agenda, including that around employer sanctions. Unions in the UK have always opposed employer sanctions, at least going back to the 1990s. And they very strongly try to avoid any kind of association with immigration enforcement, distinguish themselves from immigration enforcement and say, this is not our role. The Trade Unions Congress instead has always had the line, don't penalize people, regularize them. Why don't we find a way to give them legal status rather than trying to kind of go after them? So implications of this whole story that I've been talking about, I think there's a number of ways to kind of think about this. One is what implication does this actually have for migrants? What do we know about the experience of migrants in these different contexts? Are these policies meaningful for the experience of people trying to kind of live in these places? Well, it's hard to get a clear sense of that, but from some of the ethnographic work that people have done, it's not work I have done, but others have done, there's considerable evidence that, that these policies have mattered for where people can go to live and work. That people are aware of where it's really hard to live, like the Netherlands has come to be seen as very hard, so people will go to Belgium instead, where you can kind of find a way to exist. That Italy is easier than France, and people are aware of that as well. So some evidence that people are aware of the implications of these policies. Those who can't leave, however, who don't have the option to try to live somewhere else, seem to have been pushed further into the margins of society in a variety of ways. And this has led some critics to basically say that the policies are a policy of enforced misery, to try to make people as miserable as possible, hoping that this will induce them to leave. And of course, not everyone has that option to leave. And what are they going back to in some cases? So there's been a lot of criticism from the standpoint of the lives of migrants themselves. There's also been implications for societies in terms of mission creep, whether or not these tools then get redeployed. This infrastructural power doesn't not just then get used in other ways to target lots of other people who get caught up in various kinds of enforcement measures. A good example would be in the Netherlands. They basically initiated a set of policies, again, kind of going after benefit fraud, which tends to especially go after migrants, legal migrants, but goes after anybody who's accused of engaging in benefit fraud. And they basically, are using the tools that they've developed, the population registry and the interconnections between data sources to basically check and see, whether or not, for instance, somebody who says that they're living alone is actually living alone. And you do so by looking at their water usage, which you have access to. You can see how much water they use in their apartment. And from that, you can conclude that, oh no, there must be 2 or 3 people living there. And then you go after them for claiming a single person benefit. So this was an example of this. There has been some pushback against this, pushback from local government, pushback from civil society, and even a condemnation of this policy by a Dutch court, saying it violates people's right to privacy. So it's a sign that, even with this infrastructural power that I think is quite developed in the Dutch context, there is pushback against it still, and there's 2 faces of power. But I think what strikes me always about these kinds of powers is how, after the pushback, usually public officials just keep doing what they're doing. They just find other ways to kind of keep at it. So they are building these capacities. It's very iterative. They can face kind of resistance. But then when the resistance dies down, they find kind of ways to keep pushing the agenda forward. All right, I will conclude. I think I should finish up here, but I just want to say a kind of final sort of larger implication for politics is that I think all of these tools and techniques have played into kind of a larger set of developments that are relevant for thinking about the politics of the welfare state in these countries, which is the sort of fixation on fraud and welfare cheats that I think one could situate in a kind of larger welfare chauvinist moment that we're in. You know, and you can see this in a recent scandal in the Netherlands, a very overzealous pursuit of childcare benefit fraud that caused the collapse of the government. So some of you may have followed that. It seems that at least some of the people who they were pursuing for benefit fraud, they pursued because they're migrants. There's an overall discourse these days in many countries about welfare fraud. And how it's, you know, very much, you know, tied up with the phenomenon of immigration. So I think in a sense, one could situate these tools and techniques that are being honed and developed in these countries in light of that kind of larger set of debates. Okay, so I'll just put this up and then I'll finish. I think there are also implications for the study of the state, as I talked about earlier. That it's important, at least for me, I felt in doing this study, to really look in a very detailed, often some would say granular way at how the work of the state actually gets done. And that in doing so, you end up trying to look at the different hands of the state and the relationships between state and non-state actors. That immigration enforcement, I came to realize that so much of it actually happens not in the kind of high profile ways that I thought about when I first started studying it, but through these mechanisms of exclusion and deterrence, basically seeking to make societies and economies impenetrable and to squeeze the space in which people can live. That this is actually where a lot of the action has been in the last couple of decades. It's where a lot of the work gets done. The goal being to create this really barren landscape for migrants. And therefore sort of enlist them to do the work that state officials themselves find very difficult to do for the reasons I articulate. Okay, so final slide. States in Europe, they are not zombies. They've not dead. They've not hollowed out. Actually, I think they've thickened, if anything. They've become even more involved in oversight of their economies and societies. And so doing, they've actually expanded oversight of everybody. They've developed these techniques and tools that expand oversight as a whole. Pushback, I think, has been meaningful in many places and is ongoing. But as I said, I think state officials work very assiduously to circumvent that opposition and continue to kind of, even in a slow and often quiet behind the scenes way, to keep building up this kind of power. All right, thank you. I'm done.